So a story that's been circulating for a couple of weeks now. I actually picked it up on Nintendo Life, but I didn't want to include it in the Direct until Alex was back. There were a series of ray tracing and rendering patents published in Japan by, guess who? Nintendo. And I'm just going to quickly read out from Nintendo Patents Watch on Blue Sky what it is these patents actually are. First of all, a ray tracing method that allows per object reflection control. Secondly, a ray tracing method that ensures correct reflection near screen edges. And finally, a more performant shadow mapping technique. I wanted to wait until Alex was back to take a look at these patents. And, they are in Japanese, so we had to machine translate them. But it's time to go into debunking mode again, isn't it, Alex?
I guess so,
we got this question from Darjar Co. in brackets, Dan. Happy half fortnight, lads. Lads in block capitals there, exclamation point. Glad to hear that Alex has gotten around to do a deep dive on Nintendo. So I was going to say Alex's ray tracing patents.
Well, that'd be cool.
Nintendo's ray tracing patents. How likely do you think that these quote-unquote lightweight RT methods will be available by Nintendo to third parties? They have made Nintendo DLS available to third parties, so it doesn't seem totally impossible, does it? Also, how would you compare the Switch 2's RT capabilities to the Series S? As far as I understand it, there's a good chance it could achieve more without as many sacrifices due to a more parallel architecture. Let's park the second part of that. Let's talk about the patents first of all, because I think you're about to sort of burst a lot of balloons, a lot of bubbles there, Alex.
Well, I don't even want to go into specifics with them, because they're very, unfortunately, in spite of the Patent Watch Blue Sky account, they are very uninteresting. They happen to be in Nintendo's name, but they do not cover things that I think most people will be interested in. For example, the two that are labeled as covering ray tracing, maybe on a technical level, you could describe that as ray tracing. We've seen that in the past. For example, the original PDF that was brought out in presentation, I think it was actually a Drobot presentation, Rich, about the rendering in Killzone Shadowfall. Is that the name of the game?
Right.
They described their screen space reflections as screen space ray tracing. And lo and behold, this document, both of these two patents from Nintendo here describe actually screen space ray tracing. They're describing tracing against a G buffer and retrieving color at that point in time. It has nothing to do with traversing a BVH. None of the typical things we bring up, tracing against geometry. It's none of that. Tracing against a G buffer. The one that is describing, there's two of them essentially here. One describes using multiple G buffers, and based upon the distance, you select one or the other for tracing. And this can help with disocclusion issues in games. I'm not sure if there's been any ever game that is shipped with this, to my knowledge, but it is a generic idea that was brought about around the 2014 era called deep G buffers, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me in the audience if I'm wrong there. But the idea back then was actually having multiple layers in a G buffer where you could like depth peel to one of them and get less disocclusion artifacts. You could you could also expand the size of the G buffer versus the actual screen size as well too. So you could get things that were out of bounds, right? That was one of the ideas back in the day. It was used for screen space reflections as well as screen space GI, or even I think there was an AO implementation as well too. And the second one is something that Oliver's seen in games before, I believe, where I could try and think of a recent one, but typical thing that you see on bodies of water with screen space reflections, even with nicely aligned cube maps, is you'll still see the edges on the water, typically on a planar surface, are going to have like this V shape, this hourglass shape of area that's disoccluded because there's nothing there. There's nothing from there that it can trace against. And here is talking about like essentially reprojecting a coordinate closer to the middle of the screen on the edge to mask the issue. It doesn't actually fix it. It just kind of gives you the subjective appearance of it not looking so discontiguous. And that's what the one other patent's talking about right there. The partial shadow update, shadow maps patent, this was described so loosely that it is a little bit hard to actually, at least described so loosely in the machine translated version. I do not speak Japanese. That it is really hard to pin down exactly what it's talking about. But it's the basic idea that based upon what you can see in screen space, you could be updating only a certain part of the shadow map. That's about it. And so that could cover a lot of things. That could cover something like virtual shadow maps, technically, because you're paging in little small portions of a super high resolution shadow map based upon what you're seeing in screen space. It could also cover a variety of shadow caching schemes. I know, for example, the Call of Duty titles extensively use that, where they'll be keeping a lot of the shadow map static or staggered updates for them over a long period of time. And only the stuff that's really in the view frustum is going to be updated more readily. And that's basically what that covers. So at least, there's a lot of text in some of these. After they describe them in a very more specific sense, they start attaching a whole bunch of other addendum pieces to each of these patents to where it just covers almost anything. So that's the thing. But in general, unfortunately, I have to report to the audience that these are not very interesting patents. And I'm a little surprised that they could be considered patents, actually.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
But any thoughts on this, Oliver?
Not too much. I'm always frustrated with patents because oftentimes they describe like prior art pretty clearly, things that already exist in some fashion. And different patent offices have different levels of discrimination and kind of rooting that out. And I find sometimes there can be patents that describe fairly general things or things where the implementation isn't clear. And then, of course, the translation from Japanese makes this all the more complex to parse. But yeah. Certainly in terms of like the kind of reflection correction thing that's going on here, I've actually seen that recently. I think the most recent title that I saw that in was Forza Horizon 5, where kind of around the edges of the screen, they kind of warp that reflection a little bit to extend the gap. And it doesn't look, or rather to close the gap, it doesn't look very good, but maybe it's preferable to having those be kind of blank spaces where the occlusion is showing through. But they don't look very good in that case either. So yeah, I mean, in general, I just think these patents maybe indicate that Nintendo, I mean, if I was to really stretch this one, maybe they're kind of looking in general at a platform where you have to have a little bit of a harsher trade-off relative to PS5 or Series X. Maybe they're trying to cover some ground with techniques like shadow mapping and like SSR use, where you're probably going to see a lot of SSR use in this on this console, and not so much like RT reflections and things like that. But yeah, they do seem to be covered pretty extensively by prior art here.
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of a patent, as I understand it, is that somebody comes up with some fantastic brand new idea that's never been seen before and seeks to protect it. That doesn't seem to be the case here, which is a bit problematic. I guess the other thing, of course, is that I think one of the most fantastic things actually about the games industry and the graphics community within the games industry is the spirit of cooperation and sharing, that everybody is in this together, and they want to elevate visual excellence through collaboration and sharing. Now, that doesn't necessarily, and it certainly doesn't in most cases, result in sharing code as such. Although obviously you do have things like GPU Open and whatnot. It's more about, saying, sharing techniques, sharing philosophies, and for the betterment of all. This is why you have conferences like, SIGGRAPH and GDC, where, we have developers taking the stage and sharing their experience with their peers. I think this is like, I'm not really fully aware of any other industry that does this, but it's to the credit of the games industry that this does actually happen. Can you imagine, a sort of GDC presentation or a SIGGRAPH presentation where they make all of this sort of whole presentation and said, "Oh, and here's our patent. You can't use any of this."
What's the point?
That just wouldn't be particularly great, would it?
Yeah, no. To say the least, I think any sort of patentable works in the software field like this, specifically for graphics, I think it's actually all nonsense. And I think every single time it's popped up in history, it's been a big mistake. You just go back to the creative dispute with id Software and John Carmack regarding stencil shadows in Doom 3. Ridiculous that was patentable at the time, considering I think it was simultaneously discovered without knowledge. It's, kind of like DNA and stuff like that. Like they realized at the same time that you can do something that is like a common sense optimization for shadows, and they patented it. And then it made a big problem for software release at the time. And for example, software re-release, the Doom 3 BFG version or Doom 3 source code that you can find online that was released by id Software doesn't include this optimization in it due to patent stuff. So you have to engineer it in by yourself. It's really stupid. Any of this kind of stuff, I personally don't think should be applicable to the field. The one thing that does happen in the field though quite often, and you look at NVIDIA, is what they just won't tell you how they did it. They won't patent it, but they just won't tell you how they did it. They'll describe it in broad enough strokes so that you kind of get it, and then they'll just never tell you how they did it. And that's the NVIDIA way.
What about restir? That's a fairly well-known technique, right?
That is 100% out there. In fact, I think the reason why that is the case, I mean, probably NVIDIA would have loved it, but it's just such a generically ingenious thing to do that if the world didn't know about it, it'd be very sad. So I presume the scientists who did work on that at NVIDIA really wanted the world to know about it. So yeah, I think there's moments in the history of NVIDIA's software releases where they've had the individuals who worked on it saying like, nah, we can't black box this. Everyone should know about this.
Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the world would be sad.
Yes, yeah. But they do it in hardware all the time. Like when you go back and when they added in color compression to the GPUs, it just kind of showed up, and that was found out about after the fact by people investigating the GPU. People didn't know why. What was it, Maxwell, or was it?
Wasn't that some sort of variation of tile-based deferred rendering?
Oh, well, I'm thinking of DCC, when they added in DCC as well as tile-based.
Okay.
But yeah, sorry, I'm mixing up two of the things. But when they added in both of those, I'm pretty sure it required sleuthing from people who are interested in how the GPUs worked, because it didn't have an open ISA, unlike RDNA or GCN has had. Yeah.
Okay. Going back to Darjarko's question here, how would you compare the Switch 2's RT capabilities to the Series S? He reckons that there's a good chance it could achieve more without as many sacrifices due to a more parallel architecture. I think the thing is, at this point, it's all about show and tell, and we haven't seen any ray tracing on Switch 2 at the moment. And we did on Series S quite early on, limited, but it was there. So, Oliver, there's not really much we can say at this point about Switch 2 RT, is there?
No, well, I would go back to perhaps to the other topic that we were discussing recently, which is the Virtuos interview, because they did comment on that. They said the Switch 2 has less ray tracing power than Series S. And they said that DLSS might not significantly close that gap. And they also say that he sees the most potential for reflections and shadows. So, he says not as much for lighting. So I think by that he means not as much for diffuse RTGI, I'd presume, and more for kind of discrete reflections and shadows, which might be a little bit lighter weight. Maybe you could apply them a little more selectively in games. I would have to say that probably you're not going to see better ray tracing performance than Series S, but we do need to see actual visual results in games. I think probably the first point of contact with ray tracing on Switch 2, as far as I would know, would be Star Wars Outlaws, which I think is coming out in early September. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of any other titles that are currently slated to use ray tracing on the platform, but maybe we'll find out about some soon.